On the 24th of April, 1918, German tanks emerged from the morning mist outside a small French town that most people in London had never heard of, and by mid-morning they had overrun the British division defending it, opened a 3-mile gap in the Allied line, and placed the entire supply apparatus of the British Expeditionary Force within artillery range. The city of Amiens, through which flowed half the ammunition, food, and reinforcement on which the British Army in France depended, had no meaningful defense between it and the German advance. What stood between Germany and the prize that could end the war was a piece of high ground 20 kilometers to the east, and the high ground had just fallen. By afternoon, 2 Australian brigades were ordered to take it back. At night, over ground they had never walked, without artillery preparation, with hours of notice. The counterattack would cost them over 1,400 men killed and wounded. It would be launched by soldiers their own official correspondent believed had no chance of success, and it would conclude at dawn on the 3rd anniversary of Gallipoli. Tell me in the comments, have you ever heard of the Second Battle of Villers-Bretonneux before today? Because what you are about to discover will make you question everything you thought you knew about which battles actually won the First World War. Now let's go. To understand what happened on that April night, you must first understand the mathematics that made it inevitable. By the beginning of 1918, the Western Front had consumed 4 years and millions of lives without producing a decisive result for either side. France and Belgium's fields had been turned into a system of trenches and craters stretching from the English Channel to Switzerland, and no army had achieved the breakthrough that would end the stalemate. The war had become a problem that arithmetic could not solve until Russia collapsed. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, signed in March of 1918, ended the fighting on Germany's Eastern Front and freed approximately 50 divisions for transfer to France. This was Germany's window, and Germany's generals knew precisely how long it would stay open. American troops were arriving in France in growing numbers. By summer of 1918, the weight of American men and matériel would make German victory arithmetically impossible. General Erich Ludendorff, the driving intelligence behind the German war effort, drew the only conclusion available to him. Germany had to win before the window closed. The spring offensive, the Kaiserschlacht, the Kaiser's battle, was not a gamble. It was a calculation. Win now, or lose inevitably. Operation Michael struck on the 21st of March, 1918. 63 German divisions attacked over 60 miles of front, held by 26 British divisions. The assault was preceded by a short but overwhelming artillery bombardment, and the infantry that followed moved by infiltration tactics, bypassing strong points, penetrating deep before the defense could react. In 5 days, the Germans recaptured more territory than either side had taken in the previous 2 years of fighting. The British Fifth Army was effectively destroyed as a coherent force. Field Marshal Haig, facing the possibility that his army and the French might be driven apart entirely, issued his order on the 11th of April. Every position must be held to the last man. With our backs to the wall. The language of a commander who understands that the alternative to those words is the word defeat. In 10 days, the Germans were almost at the gates of Amiens. Not merely a French city, but the central railway junction on which the entire Allied war effort in France depended, handling half the supplies flowing from British base ports at Rouen, Le Havre, and Dieppe, and 80% of all North-South Allied rail traffic. Lose Amiens, and you do not merely lose a city, you sever the arteries through which the army breathes. The Allied High Command understood this with a clarity that produced, on the 26th of March, the Doullens Conference, where Haig agreed to the appointment of France's Marshal Foch as supreme commander of all Allied armies on the Western Front. That a supreme commander had to be invented in a single afternoon is the precise measure of how close to catastrophe things actually stood. The German advance stalled east of Amiens in early April, held by a combination of Allied resistance and the exhaustion of armies that had outrun their supply lines. But Ludendorff had not abandoned the objective. He had merely paused. Between his paused army and the prize it needed stood one piece of ground that both sides understood with complete clarity: Villers-Bretonneux, a town of several thousand people 20 kilometers east of Amiens, sitting on a ridge overlooking the main road and railway line running directly west into the city. From that ridge, the Gothic towers of Amiens Cathedral were visible on a clear day, 10 miles to the west. Whoever controlled the high ground could bring Amiens under direct artillery fire. And if the advance continued through the town, infantry would follow. Villers-Bretonneux was not merely strategically important. It was the last real impediment to a German advance on the most consequential target on the Western Front. The Australians arrived in this part of France not by design, but by emergency. Most of the Australian Corps infantry had been concentrated around Messines and Flanders when the spring offensive began. They were rushed south to plug gaps in a disintegrating British line, fighting a series of difficult defensive battles in late March and early April, at Hebuterne, at Dernancourt, at Morlancourt, at Hangard Wood, at Hazebrouck, actions largely forgotten because the line held, and history tends to remember disasters more reliably than the saves. Just one name in that list has endured. At Villers-Bretonneux, between the 30th of March and the 5th of April, the Australian 9th Brigade and British units repelled a determined German attempt on the town. The line held. The town remained in Allied hands. The Australians had paid for it, and kept it. Then they handed it over. In the days before the 24th of April, in a planned and routine relief, Australian troops defending the Villers-Bretonneux sector were replaced by the British 8th Division. The exchange made administrative sense. The Australians were needed elsewhere. The British were available. The paperwork was in order. What no piece of paper recorded was that the 8th Division taking over the line was not the formation its records described. In France, since November of 1914, it had lost 250 officers and 4,693 men in the spring offensive alone. The experienced professional corps had been replaced by reinforcements recently arrived from England, who were described by General Sir Henry Rawlinson, the Fourth Army commander overseeing the sector, as young boys under fire for the first time. One Australian soldier, looking at them, put it less charitably: pink-faced, round-cheeked children. They were not cowards. They were 18-year-olds who had been handed a position on a ridge that a professional German army was methodically preparing to assault, and they had not been given sufficient means to stop it. The Germans, for their part, had been preparing for weeks. 15 A7V tanks had been allocated to the assault. On the night of the 21st of April, 14 of them, one had refused to start, were loaded onto trains, transported by rail to the village of Guillocourt, unloaded in darkness, and hidden near Wiencourt-l'Equipé, 4 kilometers from the German front line, concealed, waiting. The ground had been assessed by German engineers as suitable for armor, firm, gently sloping, relatively free of the shell craters that had made tank operations impossible across most of the Western Front for most of the war. The Germans had done their reconnaissance. The men who would face those tanks had spent the previous day on full alert, expecting an attack that never came, and were trying to recover their composure when the real assault arrived 24 hours later than they had been warned to expect. German deserters had warned on the 21st that a major attack was imminent. British and Australian artillery shelled German assembly areas on the night of the 22nd. The garrison stood at readiness before dawn on the 23rd. No attack came. The timing of the actual assault was not coincidence. Before dawn on the 24th of April, 1918, the German artillery opened on British positions with a mix of high explosive and mustard gas. Captain M.S. Essler, the medical officer of the 2nd Middlesex Regiment, would later recall that he had never known such a barrage of shell fire, that it was like walking through Dante's Inferno. The 8th Division's 24th Brigade, shattered by the bombardment, was pulled back to the reserve line at Bois-l'Abbé. The 23rd Brigade was sent forward to replace them. Then the German infantry came. They advanced in single file through the gas and the morning fog, each company following the previous, their full strength hidden until they reached British lines and fanned out. The 8th Division's positions were overwhelmed. A 3-mile gap was opened in the Allied line. Villers-Bretonneux fell. 3 German A7Vs converged on the area near Kachi, 3 kilometers southwest of the town, where 3 British Mark IV tanks had been operating. The A7V was a weapon of a particular kind of mechanical arrogance, a rectangular steel fortress of 32 tons, crewed by 18 men, armed with a 57mm cannon and 6 Maxim machine guns, moving at a walking pace across terrain that had been surveyed specifically to suit it. The men inside had been issued fire-resistant asbestos coveralls. Most refused to wear them, not because of the heat, but because they understood that captured tank crewmen were an entirely new category of prisoner in this war, and they had no confidence about how that category would be treated. They went into the first tank battle in history in ordinary uniforms, in a steel box, carrying no precedent for what was about to happen. Lieutenant Wilhelm Biltz, commanding A7V Nix, saw the 3 British vehicles moving through the smoke toward him and recognized the moment immediately. 2 of the British tanks were females, armed with nothing but machine guns, entirely incapable of damaging German armor. The one that mattered was the male, carrying a 6-pounder cannon, commanded by Lieutenant Frank Mitchell. Mitchell scored 5 hits on the Nix. The German tank spun on one track, rolled off the railway embankment, and crashed onto its side. 1 crewman was killed. Biltz and 8 survivors scrambled free under machine gun fire. The other 2 German A7Vs retreated back into Villers-Bretonneux. The first tank battle in history lasted minutes and produced a lesson: that cannon-armed tanks could destroy machine gun-armed tanks, which the next generation of military planners would need several decades to fully absorb. A 4th German tank, A7V Mephisto, became stuck in a shell crater near Monument Wood during the fighting south of the town. Its crew abandoned it. Australian troops recovered the tank in July, and after the war, it was taken to Australia as a trophy. It sits today in the Queensland Museum in Brisbane, its Red Devil logo still visible on the hull, the only surviving A7V in existence. Retrieved from the battlefield it had been sent to capture, now in the country of the soldiers who took the town back. By mid-morning, Villers-Bretonneux was firmly in German hands, and British counterattack attempts had produced nothing. North of the town, the high ground was still held by Major General Talbot Hobbs's Australians of the 5th Division, a fact that shaped everything that followed. As long as Hobbs's men held that ridge, the Germans inside the town were overlooked and could not break westward without exposing themselves to devastating fire from above. The town had fallen. The strategic position had not yet collapsed, but the Germans were consolidating with every passing hour, pushing their positions outward, making themselves harder to dislodge with every failed British attempt. Rawlinson surveyed what his commanders were offering him and delivered his assessment in 5 words. "We must get it back whatever happens." He said it in the afternoon, and the man who would take it back had been straining for permission to do exactly that since dawn. Harold Edward Elliot was born on the 19th of June, 1878, in the West Charlton district of Victoria, the son of a farmer. He read law at the University of Melbourne and left in 1900 to fight in South Africa with the Victorian Imperial Bushmen, not for the commission the British Army offered when he distinguished himself, but because the men he had trained with were going, and he intended to go with them. He won the Distinguished Conduct Medal. He declined the British commission. It was the first evidence of a character that would define him across 3 decades. Given the chance to advance individually, he returned to his people. His men called him Pompey. He disliked the nickname and could never shake it. He was famous for his discipline and training, and in the assessment of those who served under him, a commander of almost godlike status, revered in the way men reserve for officers who demand everything and give more in return. At Gallipoli, he had landed on the 25th of April, 1915, the first Anzac day, and been wounded and evacuated on the same day. He did not return until June. At Lone Pine in August, he held off Turkish counterattacks for 24 hours of hand-to-hand combat in confined trenches. 7 Victoria Crosses were awarded for Lone Pine. 4 went to men of his battalion. His own work was not recognized. It was the beginning of a grievance that would outlast the war. In March of 1916, Elliot was given command of the new 15th Brigade of the 5th Division, all Victorians. He led them through the disaster of Fromelles in July of that year, a catastrophe he had predicted and lobbied against. His subsequent report was so damning of British command decisions that General Birdwood ordered all copies destroyed. By April of 1918, after Polygon Wood and the grinding attrition of 3rd Ypres, Elliot had been shaped into something precise and irreversible, a man who was right about tactical situations before they became disasters, constitutionally incapable of pretending otherwise, and carrying an unbroken record of being the most difficult subordinate his superiors had and the most trusted commander his men had followed. He had kept 2 battalions on immediate standby throughout that day because he had been certain since dawn that the British line would crack. The moment the town fell, he pushed to counterattack at noon. He was overruled as suicidal. He was right about that assessment, too. Thomas William Glasgow was born on the 6th of June, 1876, near Maryborough in Queensland. He left school, worked as a clerk, and ran his father's grocery store after South Africa, where he had served as a lieutenant with the Queensland Mounted Infantry and won the Distinguished Service Order. He married Annie Stum in April of 1904. None of this biography announces a man who would be described at Gallipoli as reckless in personal bravery, while simultaneously being noted as astute in command, a combination rare enough that his superiors recorded it specifically. He led parties into Turkish trenches and survived, in the assessment of those who watched, apparently by miracle. When the Australian forces expanded after the Gallipoli evacuation, Glasgow left his mounted troops to command an infantry brigade. He did not require others to notice the sacrifice. The 13th Brigade he commanded on the 24th of April was composed of soldiers from Queensland, South Australia, Western Australia, and Tasmania, the outer states, men from the edges of a continent who had been fighting as a formation since Mouquet Farm in 1916, through Messines, Polygon Wood, and Durnan Corps in early April of 1918, where they had spent several days holding the line against the same German offensive, now pressing toward the town they were about to be ordered to retake. At 9:30 in the morning, Glasgow received word that his brigade, currently in reserve at Carrier, 13 kilometers north of the Somme, was to march toward Villers-Bretonneux. They moved through the afternoon toward a battle they did not know, over country they had never seen. The plan assembled through that afternoon was elegant in concept and dependent on several improbable things happening simultaneously in complete darkness. 2 brigades would advance on either side of the town, Elliott's 15th from the north, Glasgow's 13th from the south, and link up at Monument Wood to the east, encircling the German garrison inside Villers-Bretonneux. British troops would follow to clear the town itself. In the language of military planning, it was a pincer movement, a classic envelopment. In the language of the men who would execute it, it was something else entirely. Glasgow's brigade had never walked the terrain they would advance over. No reconnaissance was possible because there was no time. There would be no preliminary bombardment for the 13th Brigade, no creeping artillery barrage to suppress the defenders as they moved, because coordination was impossible in the hours available. The Bois d'Arquin, a wood to the south of the town sitting directly beside Glasgow's axis of advance, had been reported as cleared of the enemy. It had not been cleared. During the gap in British lines that afternoon, German machine guns had moved into the wood and established prepared positions. Nobody on the Allied side knew. The 2 attacking brigades came from different divisions, with no prior experience of operating together. The British 8th Division, nominally in command of the overall operation, had just spent the day being overrun. The timing debate was its own drama. General Henniker, commanding the 8th Division, proposed 8 o'clock as the attack time. Glasgow's response was immediate. If God Almighty gave the order, we couldn't do it by daylight. He proposed 10:30, attack under moonlight, with enough darkness to conceal the approach. The compromise settled at 10 o'clock. When Rawlinson proposed diagonal approaches that would expose the Australians to flanking fire as they crossed the face of the town, Glasgow rejected it directly. Why, it's against the teaching of your own army to attack across the face of the enemy. He insisted on lateral advances, move parallel to the town on each side, then turn in to encircle it. Rawlinson accepted the revision. Glasgow had arrived at the planning session, having marched his brigade 13 kilometers that afternoon, and immediately corrected the 4th Army commander's tactical approach. He was right on both counts. Even 10 o'clock proved too early for the brigades to reach their start lines in time. Charles Bean, Australia's official correspondent, had witnessed virtually every major AIF action since Gallipoli. He was nearby when the attack was planned, understood what was being asked, and recorded his verdict in his diary. I don't believe they have a chance. I scarcely think it will come off. A veteran of the 59th Battalion called it an almost impossible proposition. These were not timid men delivering timid assessments. They were experienced observers who had seen enough of the Western Front to calculate odds accurately. Elliott made sure his men ate before they went, hot tea, and, as one soldier later recalled, plenty of hot stew, as much as we could stuff into us. He understood that the distance between what planning documents described and what men would actually face could be measured in calories as much as courage. David Winfield had been a school teacher before the war. He was now a stretcher bearer with the 60th Battalion, and he wrote in his diary while waiting for the order to advance. Since 10 last night, we have been rigged up already to march off to support, and now it is to counterattack for some ground, lost by the Tommies this morning. It is a terrible time. Nerves are being shredded. It is too much for mortals. At 10 o'clock on the evening of the 24th of April, 1918, the guns opened on a 4,000-yard front. The 13th Brigade crossed its start line and moved south. Almost immediately, nothing went as planned. The Bois d'Arquin was not cleared. The machine guns that had moved into the wood during the afternoon opened on the advancing Australians with the efficiency of prepared positions, firing at men crossing open ground. The advance was pinned. Men were dying in the dark beside a wood they had been told presented no obstacle. Lieutenant Clifford William King Sadleir was 26 years old, born in the Melbourne suburb of Camberwell, promoted to lieutenant on the 1st of April, 1918, 23 days before this night. He served in the 51st Battalion. His military career had begun in Egypt with the Medical Corps before he transferred to the infantry and worked his way to officer rank through the methodical accumulation of demonstrated competence. His platoon was on the left of the battalion when the machine guns in the Bois d'Arquin stopped the advance. He had already been wounded. He collected his bombing section and led them into the trees against the gun positions. They killed the crews and captured 2 guns. By the time it was done, every man in his section was either dead or wounded. Sadlier was standing, still wounded, and there was a 3rd machine gun. He attacked it with his revolver. He killed the crew. He took the gun. He was wounded again. His citation would later describe this as characterized by coolness and utter disregard of danger, language so institutional that it requires translation. 1 man, alone, twice wounded, every companion fallen, going forward with a sidearm against a prepared position. That is what the citation described. The advance of the 13th Brigade resumed. Sergeant Charlie Stokes, who had fought alongside Sadlier in the wood, received the Distinguished Conduct Medal for his part in the same action. Elements of the brigade fought toward the southern outskirts of the town and pushed close to the positions where they expected to find Elliott's men. Monument Wood, the planned meeting point. Nothing was there. No sign of the 15th Brigade. The surviving officers made the decision that preserved the formation, consolidate south of the town rather than overextend into an exposed position in the dark, waiting for a link-up that hadn't happened. The pincer was not closed. Not yet. At the height of the fighting, with his brigade pressed on 3 sides and German commanders sending forward a message demanding that he surrender, Glasgow's response required no elaboration. Tell them to go to hell. The 15th Brigade's attack had been delayed 2 hours. It came at midnight. The official historian of the Australian 5th Division recorded what that sounded like. A wild and terrible yell from hundreds of throats split the midnight air, and the whole line broke into a rapid run and surged irresistibly forwards, bayonets gleaming thirstily in the moonlight. The 59th and 60th Battalions led the advance to the high ground northwest of the town. What they encountered: German positions, machine gun nests, the ordinary defensive machinery of a held line. They attacked with the directness the midnight yell had announced was coming. The advance was not clean. It was not executed according to the plan drawn up that afternoon. The formal link-up with the 13th Brigade at Monument Wood never happened, as intended. What happened instead was the cumulative result of 2 imperfect advances from opposite directions, Australian soldiers on 3 sides of the German garrison. The town was not encircled with the precision the plan had required, but the Germans inside could no longer break westward. The objective, not the tactical objective of the plan, but the reason 2 brigades had been sent into darkness over unknown country, was being achieved by men too busy fighting to understand what they were achieving. The sun rose on the 25th of April, 1918, the 3rd anniversary of Gallipoli. What the morning light revealed was a pocket, the German garrison inside Villers-Bretonneux, surrounded on 3 sides, its eastern escape route closing as Australian positions consolidated. Elements of the 57th Battalion began moving toward the town from the northeast, clearing Germans and handing prisoners to British troops advancing behind them. More than 900 prisoners were taken across the course of the battle. The 2nd Northamptonshire Regiment and the 2nd Durham Light Infantry entered the town itself to clear the garrison street by street. The Northamptonshire's commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel S.G. Latham, was killed inside Villers-Bretonneux. This is not a detail that Australian-centered accounts of the battle have generally found important to preserve. The Australians watching from outside were critical of the British pace. The British were attacking directly into the prepared positions that the Australian encirclement had deliberately bypassed. They were doing the harder thing, at full cost, while the Australians held the ring. The fighting to consolidate the position continued through the 26th and 27th of April. The French Moroccan division, whose role in most accounts of this battle is absent or marginal, played a crucial part on the 26th in pushing back German units in the southern sector. On the 27th, the 60th Battalion fought a costly action to straighten the line. A German counterattack was broken up before it could develop. The front quieted. Glasgow wrote to his wife, not a dispatch claiming what his brigade had accomplished. A letter to Annie, full of praise for his soldiers. The man who had marched 13 kilometers that afternoon over country he'd never walked, corrected an army commander's plan before the attack, refused to surrender when pressed on 3 sides, and helped stop a German army, wrote to his wife about how well his soldiers had performed. He claimed nothing for himself. It was, in its way, the most eloquent document the battle produced. The immediate military result was beyond dispute. Villers-Bretonneux was back in Allied hands less than 24 hours after falling to the Germans. The German advance on Amiens was permanently stopped. After the 25th of April, the German divisions on the Somme front went on the defensive and did not regain the initiative. 3 months later, on the 8th of August, 1918, the great Allied offensive that would become the 100 Days began just east of Villers-Bretonneux, with Australian and Canadian troops leading. Ludendorff called it the Black Day of the German Army. The road to that day ran through the ridgeline 2 brigades had held in the dark. The coincidence of the date was not lost on those present. The counterattack that began on the 24th concluded successfully at dawn on the 25th of April, the 3rd anniversary of the Gallipoli landing. The men who had waded ashore at Anzac Cove on the 25th of April, 1915, were, exactly 3 years later, holding a French town against the German army that had just overrun a British division to take it. They had not planned the calendar. The calendar had arranged itself. Australians who know this battle sometimes call it our other Anzac Day, a phrase that carries both the coincidence and the cost. The cost in the counterattack itself was 1,009 men killed and wounded in the 13th Brigade, 455 in the 15th, more than 2,400 Australians across the full battle, a figure that includes the over 1,000 who had become mustard gas casualties in the days before the assault, men already blinded or incapacitated before a shot was fired on the 24th. The 13th Brigade's losses were severe enough that one of its 4 battalions, the 52nd, was broken up in May of 1918, its men absorbed into the surviving 3. A battalion erased by the weight of what it had accomplished. Clifford Sadleir was evacuated to Australia on the 24th of August, 1918, and discharged on the 4th of March, 1919. He served for a time as State Secretary of the Returned Services League in Western Australia. He died on the 28th of April, 1964, in Busselton, Western Australia, aged 71. He had attacked a machine gun crew with a revolver on the night of the 24th of April, 1918, and had lived for 46 years afterward, in a country that knew, in the general way countries know things, that something significant had happened at a place called Villers-Bretonneux. Glasgow received a knighthood, command of the 1st Division in June of 1918, 2 terms as Senator for Queensland, the position of Minister for Defence, and in December of 1939, an appointment as Australia's first High Commissioner to Canada. He died on the 4th of July, 1955, aged 79, a life that contained nearly everything the nation could offer a soldier who served it well. In it, he found almost everything except the recognition of which night had been the hardest. Harold Elliot did not live that long. He had expected divisional command after Villers-Bretonneux. 3 commands became available afterward. He received none of them. He pursued the injustice of this, and it was an injustice. The record supports him. Through the Senate and through correspondence with his superiors for more than a decade, with the same directness he had brought to every command he had held, to the same effect, admired by those who had been there, increasingly marginalized by those who had not. His brother George, a captain in the medical corps attached to the 14th Brigade, had been killed by a shell fragment at Chateau Wood. His older sister Nell died by suicide. A niece also. In 1927, 9 years after the Midnight Charge, he was finally promoted to Major General and given command of the 3rd Division. The bitterness had by then become inseparable from the man. On the morning of the 23rd of March, 1931, Elliot took his own life with his shaving razor while an inpatient at a private hospital in Malvern, Victoria. He was 52 years old. The diagnosis was what a later generation would recognize as chronic post-traumatic stress disorder and major depression, then described by his doctors as a definite form of nervous disorder. He had been living with the accumulated weight of what he had seen, ordered, and survived for 13 years, since the night of the Midnight Charge. His funeral took place on the 25th of March. Following a short service at his home in East Camberwell, his casket was drawn on a gun carriage pulled by horses, fitted with black plumes, with bands and an escort party, to Burwood Cemetery, a march of 4 miles. Thousands lined the route. Former Prime Minister Stanley Bruce marched as a common returned soldier. It was, measured against what Elliot had done and what he had been denied, the most the institution could manage. The ceremony of the gun carriage offered to the man from whom the substance had been withheld for 13 years. The town he helped save had been keeping different books. Victorian school children began raising money after the war to rebuild Villers-Bretonneux School, which had been destroyed in the fighting. The Victoria School was completed in 1927, the same year Elliot finally received his long-deferred promotion, built with funds gathered by Australian children too young to have fought, and old enough to understand that something was owed. John Grant, an Australian artist, and students from the Daylesford Technical School in Victoria carved 16 wooden panels for the school's Victoria Room, depicting Australian fauna and flora, lyrebirds, clematis, the natural world of a country on the other side of the earth. Those panels remain in the school today. Above the blackboards in each classroom, 4 words have been written for a century. N'oublions jamais l'Australie. In the playground, in English. Do not forget Australia. French children have been reading those words above their lessons since 1927. After the Black Saturday bushfires swept through Victoria on the 7th of February, 2009, destroying communities across the state, the children of Villers-Bretonneux began collecting money to donate toward rebuilding one of the destroyed Australian schools. The debt had become something different from obligation. It had become the ordinary behavior of people who understood, without needing to explain it, that this relationship ran in both directions. The Australian National Memorial above Villers-Bretonneux was unveiled on the 22nd of July, 1938, designed by Sir Edwin Lutyens, and placed on the high ground north of the town, the ridge that Hobbes's Australians had held throughout April the 24th, the ground whose defense had made the counterattack possible in the first place. It carries the names of 10,982 Australians with no known grave in France, a UNESCO World Heritage Site since 2023. Every year on Anzac Day, a dawn service is held on that ridge. In 2018, for the centenary, 8,000 people gathered before sunrise. Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull stood beside his French counterpart and said that the Australians had come from the other side of the world to defend the freedom of France. and that they were meeting 100 years later on land long-heeled to remember them. The land is long-heeled. The accounting is not entirely settled. Charles Bean, whose official history shaped virtually every subsequent account of this battle, cited the praise of Brigadier General Grogan, who had called the operation perhaps the greatest individual feat of the war, without disclosing that Grogan was referring primarily to the work of his own British brigade, the 23rd of the 8th Division. The French Moroccan Division's crucial contribution on April the 26th is absent from most Australian-centered tellings. The British soldiers who cleared Villers-Bretonneux house by house, at the cost of their commanding officer and many others, appear in the dominant version of events as a footnote to an Australian story. The Australian War Memorial's own exhibition acknowledges, with institutional frankness, that the Australian role has been exaggerated in some accounts. General Monash described Villers-Bretonneux as the turning point of the war. Historian Peter Dennis has characterized that as an overstatement. Both observations can be true simultaneously: decisive for the Somme front, important for the whole war, and not requiring inflation to produce the effect inflation is usually deployed to create. What happened on the night of the 24th of April, 1918, does not need embellishment. Glasgow's 13 kilometers over country he'd never walked. Elliott's hot stew in the dark before the charge. Sadlier's revolver, twice wounded, alone, his section fallen around him, one more gun to take. Winfield in his diary, "It is too much for mortals." The wild yell at midnight, the dawn on Anzac Day, 1918, revealing a pocket where the German garrison had been, and the road to Amiens closed behind it. Elliott never came home to the command the record said he had earned. Glasgow came home to nearly everything, except recognition of which night had been hardest. Sadlier came home to Busselton with his Victoria Cross and lived for 46 years in a country that told the story imperfectly. The men of the 52nd Battalion came home to a unit that no longer existed, dissolved into others because the cost of what it had done had consumed it. In a classroom in Villers-Bretonneux, above a blackboard, 4 words have been written for a century by people who were not there and nevertheless understood what they owed. The town the Australians saved hasn't forgotten. The country that did the saving has remembered in the way that countries remember things that happened at night, over unfamiliar country, with too few witnesses who stayed long enough to tell the whole story. If you believe those men deserve to be remembered fully, leave a comment below. And if you want to understand how what was held at Villers-Bretonneux became the launching point for the offensive that finally broke the German army, watch this next.